Hello and welcome to Choose FI. Today on the show, we have an episode that I've been looking forward to for a while. We have Dr. Bobby Dubois, who is a Harvard grad with a medical degree from Johns Hopkins, residency in internal medicine, and a PhD in health policy. He's published 180 plus academic peer-reviewed publications. And more importantly than that, he is a physician scientist who's focused on figuring out what works for patients and what does not. And what I love about Dr. Bobby is that he curates the information. He makes it simple to understand, and he focuses on the essential topics. And he's distilled them down to 6 pillars. We're going to go through each one of them. And I've heard him on multiple podcasts, including his own, which is a brand new podcast called Live Long and Well with Dr. Bobby that is truly fantastic. So stop listening to this, hit subscribe to that real quick. It summarizes everything that I've been trying to learn over the last 10 years on my health journey. And he so succinctly and beautifully describes this and summarizes it that it is the podcast that I'm now recommending for people focused on optimizing and bettering their health. I think you're really going to enjoy this. With that, welcome to Choose FI. Bobby, thank you for being here. I've been looking forward to this for a while. This is going to be great.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. My mother would be proud. I'll have to share it with her.
Well, I aim to please, my friend. It is certainly the least that I could do. It's an impressive background. And like I said, really more importantly, you're focused on helping people, not just wowing them with all this information and maybe overwhelming them, frankly. I think that's what a lot of podcasters focus on health do. You're actually cutting to the heart. And I think that's what's so important. One other thing I forgot to mention is you're an Ironman triathlete at the age of 67. And you told me you just finished a triathlon last week. Talk to me about the background of that.
Well, when I was at Harvard, I had some folks in my dorm that had done the Boston Marathon. This is back in the 70s. And they looked like death warmed over in the bathtub with ice all over them. And I was like, God, that's a crazy thing to do. But those were the early days of running. As I was approaching 40, it was like, well, if I'm ever going to do a marathon, and this was 30 years ago, I should probably get going. And it turned out very soon after I started doing them, everybody did. Al Gore did them. Oprah Winfrey did one. So it became very democratized. And that's been a wonderful thing for folks and for their health. And then after doing that for about 10, 15 years, it was like, well, somebody said, let's go for a bike ride. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, a triathlon is just, some running and some biking. And then, there's a swim thing in the beginning. And of course, I started short and small and fairly quick. And then I got the longer ones and the longer ones. And, 20 years later of doing these, here I am.
So 500 yards or thereabouts in a sprint triathlon for a swim up to 2.4 miles in the Ironman? Is that roughly accurate?
Yes, it's a lot longer swim. It's a long day, as I like to say.
My girls are both swimmers, so I know whenever they're both sprinters too. So 50 and 100 yard generally, but whenever they have to swim the mile, that is not a fun swim meet, needless to say. So, all right, let's get into it. I mentioned in passing these 6 pillars, and it was interesting, and I will go into them just real quick, each of the 6, and then we'll dive into each individually. But when you kind of jokingly said, my marathon friends look like death warmed over or thereabouts, right? And I wonder actually how that might tie into pillar number 1, which is exercise, and a large portion of that being strength training. And I feel like even the running community has evolved to understand just the importance of muscle building and strength training from maybe those early days in the 70s and 80s of the running fad. So I wonder, and I don't know if you have an answer to this, but if your friends would look similarly as deathly today as compared to the 70s.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the technology in the shoes has changed so much, and just training and how you train. I mean, back then, the more miles, the better. Now it's the smarter miles, the better. So it's a whole different world now, fortunately.
Yeah. So random little sidebar, but okay, let's get into, as I understand it, these 6 pillars are exercise, sleep, nutrition, mind-body work, heat and cold exposure, and social relationships. So I think when I look at a holistic life of health, I mean, that pretty much about covers it. I think some people might be surprised by the hot and cold exposure, that rises to the level of a pillar. But let's put a pin in that and come back. So let's start with pillar number one, which is exercise. And I think this is, I know, top of mind for me. And I've talked about this in the past on episode 480, where I had my trainer, Dean Turner, on. And I've been focused on muscle building and strength building the last 18 months. And it's been just a humongous change for me. But I'd love to throw it to you for, where do you start when it comes for having people understand the importance of exercise?
Well, it's a great question. And let me sort of set the stage not only for this pillar, but for all of them. So, my focus is really on what works in human beings, people like the folks that are listening. I don't really care what happens in dogs or yeast or mice or laboratory things that happen in blood. I really want to ask the question, what do we know about studies in humans? Were they good studies? Did they show and make a difference? So for this pillar and for all of them, that's what I curate. That's what I'm focused on. So exercise. Yeah, the number one cause of death in the United States is cardiovascular disease, and exercise has been shown to really, really make a difference. There's a series of studies of over 500,000 people, and they found that people who exercise had 20-30% reduction in heart attacks and deaths associated with it. And being sedentary not only allows us to gain more weight, but it also affects how long we live, the likelihood of getting cognitive decline or dementia, and so many other things. And not to mention the sort of mood enhancing element that exercise does. Where it gets a little confusing is that when people think of exercise, they think of the typical CDC recommendations. Oh, you need to get 2.5 to 5 hours of aerobic exercise every week. And I think that's great. I think everybody should. And that means getting your heart rate up enough so that it's not trivially easy to talk, but you can still talk. So you're a little huffing and puffing, but not too badly. And people think, okay, I do that. I play pickleball. I go for walks. I take my dog for the walk. I bike occasionally. I'm done. Well, the problem is with exercise, to really get the health benefits, there's 4 pieces of the puzzle. It's not just the aerobics. So the aerobics is one element. Strength, as you alluded to, is another critical element. And as we age, people may know, we lose about 2% of our muscle mass each and every year. And if you do the math, and this audience is probably good at doing the math, you lose a lot in a decade and add another decade and another decade. So if you don't get ahead of the curve on strength, you'll be in big trouble. The third piece of the puzzle is balance. And the number one problem that folks worry about as they get older is falling. And balance and strength training are critical to help us prevent that. And the last piece of the puzzle people may not realize is the importance of high intensity bursts of speed or anaerobic stuff. And it isn't just for sprinters getting ready for the Olympics. It's important for all of us. And we can come back and talk a little bit about why it's important for everyone. So there are 4 pieces of the puzzle. It isn't just as simple as I'm going to get a half hour of walking a day. That's a great start. And I want people to make a great start. But keep in mind, there's a few other pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's a really important overview. And it was funny because as you were describing that person of, hey, they're maybe puffing and puffing a little bit, which might be like people have heard of zone 2 exercise that could possibly constitute. But if you're just talking about, hey, we're just going to walk a little bit, that's probably not going to cover it. So yeah, those 4 aspects are critical. I think I would like to start maybe with, I guess, people who are more sedentary. So I track pretty much everything I do. I have an Oura Ring, I have a Fitbit. And Bobby, it is startling, even for me, who I think of myself as a pretty active and fit guy. On a normal day, if I'm not making a concerted effort, I probably walk under 4,000 steps a day or move under 4,000 steps a day. That's without any concerted, specific walks. I mean, that's startling. And I'm always running up and down the stairs, grabbing things. Like, I feel like I'm moving. So I wonder what, quote unquote, normal people are doing. I mean, I fear it's under 2,000 steps a day for so many people. And we always hear this 10,000 step thing. And I think that's largely been proven that it was essentially made up. But regardless, it's directionally accurate for me to get from 4,000 steps a day to 10,000. I have to take about 60 minutes of a walk. I mean, I might split that up. I actually, just before we hit play on this, I took a 15-minute walk just because I'd been sitting for too long. So that gets me a little bit there. But man, Bobby, it's hard. I think it's a very long way of saying like it's really hard to get anywhere up there. But I think it's really a big deal to go from essentially nothing to moving more.
The beauty of exercise is there's no threshold. If you're doing none and you start doing 10 minutes, you will get benefits. And if you can do 20 minutes, you'll get more benefits. And there's probably no upper bound. So people should not feel like, well, I can't do what Dr. Bobby says, so I'm not even going to bother. You will get about 80% of the benefits by doing a relatively small amount. And I encourage you, just begin and you may catch on and love it. You're absolutely right about the number of steps. The number of steps, the 10,000, people might find this interesting where that number came many years ago from Japan. There was a company that was about to release, in the old days, we used to call them pedometers, these little things that you would wear that had like a little pendulum in them, and it would count your steps. This was a Japanese company, and they were thinking, oh, what should they call it and what should they think about this? And there was and I don't really know Japanese characters, but there's a character that looks like a human being, and that became their logo. And oh, by the way, that character is 10,000. And so it was a marketing issue, not a science-based one, that gave us the 10,000. Now, fast forward several decades, people are interested in the blue zones, these places around the world where not everybody lives to be 100, but more people live to be 100 than elsewhere in the world. And people have investigated, well, what is it about those places? Well, on average, they get about 10,000 steps a day. So there is both the marketing behind this and the story behind that, as well as actually some budding science around it. And you're absolutely correct. In years past, Americans got a whole lot more steps. And your 4,000 to 5,000 is very typical. I think you're right. There are many people that are way less than that. And if you want to go down this rabbit hole, we can, to talk a little bit about what happens when you sit. But sitting too long is not a good thing. And all of the Apple Watches and all those other things nowadays can set reminders to get up and get out and walk around for 15 minutes.
Yeah, I would love to go into that actually. So let's do that combined with, if you don't mind, one thing that I've learned or certainly heard of recently, especially by the company Levels, which they make the continuous glucose monitor. Dr. Casey Means, I think, is one of the co-founders, and she was talking. And again, I've heard on their podcast, A Whole New Level, where basically one of the ways they've found with all the millions or tens of millions of data points through their CGMs is taking a walk after a meal is one of the best ways to regulate blood glucose. And I always look for those little snippets of like, what's something easy I can do? And also to try to put together commonalities. So Tim Ferriss, in his 4-Hour Body that he published over a decade ago, he talked actually about doing something simple like air squats, like before and after a meal. And he was talking about blood glucose control. So it's interesting to see a non-scientist talk about it in N of 1, which I know is something that's near and dear to your heart. And then to see a company like Levels talk about it so many years later with tens of millions of data points for it. So I know that's kind of a lot to throw at you all at once, but I'm curious how like little snippets of exercise as opposed to long periods of sitting tie in, and if we can maybe somehow tie these together.
So what you raise and the points that the folks made are so important. And I'll give a little life hack addition to that. So what you said is, well, you should go for a 15-minute walk after your meal. Totally endorse that. Sounds great for a whole host of reasons. Here's one that people may not have thought about. And this will come up later if we talk about nutrition. Take a 15-minute walk in the middle of your meal.
Ooh.
Now, this may seem like I'm out with my wife at a restaurant. No, I don't think that's going to work. But so many people are concerned that they eat too much and, they're hungry and it's hard to keep their weight under control. And that is a critical piece of the puzzle for health. I have found, and I haven't found any randomized trial of this topic, but everybody I've talked to says, yes, that's absolutely true. So, what is it that gave rise to this? Go for a 15-minute walk in the middle of your meal. So, our eating of food tells our stomach and our brain at some point you're full. Part of it is mechanical. When your stomach gets full of food, it tells the brain that's enough. And then there are chemicals that when you eat, then go to the brain and they say, oh, by the way, you don't need to eat anymore. The problem is it takes a while for those chemicals to be produced and get to the brain. I can't tell you how many people have told me that, yeah, this is true. If you happen to be interrupted halfway through a meal, the phone rings, you have to deal with it, your kid's having a problem, whatever it is. 15 minutes later, you come back. Oh, that other half of my plate, I'm no longer hungry.
Huh.
Because you eat faster than your brain knows that you've eaten enough. And in fact, again, to go back to the blue zones, there's in Okinawa, they have this saying, stop eating when you're 80% full.
Okay.
And they knew for 1,000 years that, your brain will catch up. So yes, take that walk, but try it in the middle of a meal just for fun. And you may get a twofer, not only the exercise, but if you're having a struggle a bit with calories, you may find you're no longer hungry. You don't want the dessert. You don't even want necessarily what's on your plate that you were obviously going to eat if you weren't interrupted. So it's a life hack to try.
Yeah, I love that. Well, if you've listened to our show, we are all about actionable takeaways and hacks like that. So that is hugely, hugely important. Let's obviously, I want to really dive into exercise, but like one step back on exercise. What are the main benefits, I guess, of exercise? I think many people myopically think it's quote unquote burning calories. Like I'm going to go on the treadmill, and because the number says I burned 257 calories, like that's what I'm getting from, like, I can eat 1/4 of a spoon of peanut butter more now because I one for one burned off those calories. Or, I'm obviously joking, but how would you describe, like, okay, what are we actually doing here?
Well, the way I look at the world is, and it's the name of my podcast, to live long and well. So, for each of these pillars, is there any data that it will help us live longer? And then, almost even more importantly, what will those later years look like and feel like? Here's an aside, but we as Americans, up until recently, were living longer and longer and longer. We're now kind of at a plateau and actually working our way down, which has to do with obesity and drug overdoses and suicides and those kinds of things. But in essence, over the last couple of decades, we live longer. The problem is those last years, which used to be basically you were pretty functional, then you drop dead. Now we've got 10 or 20 years of longer life, but those years are not good years because we have comorbid conditions and we don't have the energy and our bones and joints aren't doing very well. So if exercise can help us not only live longer, but live well and have that energy in our later years, that's so critical. And so when I look at exercise, I ask the question, will it help us live longer? Absolutely. Yes. There's no question about it. The studies, as I already alluded to, show that. Okay. But I don't want to live if my mental capacities are deteriorated. I'm not sure how much I want to live if I've had a stroke. I'm not sure how much I want to live if my blood pressure led to my kidneys going and I need to be on dialysis. And you alluded to, being a good weight. Well, if I can't get around, then I'm retired. That's great. But I can't go traveling. I can't play golf. My back hurts. All of these things are related to exercise, and exercise can help us. Look, is exercise going to reduce cancer? Yes, it does. Does that mean I will never get cancer? No, bad things happen. But exercise has been associated with that as well.
Yeah, something you said on your podcast really blew me away, where you were talking about functional health generally, but I think this really applies to exercise. And you said start with the end in mind and work backwards. And it reminds me, similar to Peter Attia's centenarian decathlon or Olympics, whatever he calls it these days, which are, hey, really sit down and think about, what do you want your life to look like when you're 70, 80, 85? And like you said, do you want to travel? Do you want to pick up the great grandkids? Do you want to, whatever, walk around the block? And if you can do that at 85, well, chances are you have to do a whole lot more now. And understanding, like you said, you have that age related muscle loss, which I think is known as sarcopenia. And that's a biological fact that's happening, right? So you need to be able to lift X amount of weight at 40 if you think you're going to be able to pick up your grandkid or lift a bag into an overhead compartment at 80. I'd love to hear how you think about starting with the end in mind when it comes to exercise.
Starting with the end in mind came out of the business literature by Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I read his book, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, and it changed my life in terms of how I look at things. And you talk about this on the podcast in terms of what is the retirement you want to have and how much money do you need. And so you're starting with that end in mind and working backwards. From a health standpoint, it's really important to think about what you want to continue to be able to do. People often think, well, I'm going to the gym and I'm doing a generic exercise program. I go on the treadmill for 30 minutes and I lift some weights and I go for a swim occasionally. Okay, this is great. Well, the reality is that the activities you want to do as you get older require different training. So, what does this mean? It means if I want to be able to pick up my grandchild, that's like a squat. And in fact, it's like a kettlebell squat. So maybe when you're 40, you ought to start doing kettlebell squats because that's the action of leaning down and getting your baby or your grandchild. If you want to go traveling and your vision is that my wife and I are going to go on various trips around the country on the plane, and we hate checking bags. So we're going to take our rollerboard and put it on the overhead bin. Well, that's 25 pounds that you have to lift up in a relatively unnatural act. Doing kettlebell squats is not going to help. You have to do a different set of exercises that will mimic the activity. Similarly, if you want to bike ride or if you want to go hiking on sort of uneven rocky trails, that's a different set of exercises. Not that it's bad to do a generic program, but spice it up with things that are important to you. And you alluded to this earlier. People have heard of the saying, use it or lose it. With exercise, unfortunately, it's overuse it or lose it. If you want to raise up 20 pounds, either your grandchild or your rollerboard, 20 years from now, you better be able to do 40 pounds today, meaning you've got to get ahead of it because you will naturally lose muscle mass and lose that. So just another thing to keep in mind. Before I go any further, I know I sound like an exercise devotee and I'm setting the bar high. Remember what I said a few minutes ago. Anything you do will bring real benefits, whether it's 5 minutes a day, 25 minutes a day, or an hour and 5 minutes a day. Whatever you do will be beneficial. Don't minimize that. My other famous saying, if I'm Voltaire, let not the great be the enemy of the good. Just because you can't do it perfectly, that's okay. Just do what you can do, and that will help.
I love that. That is brilliant, brilliant advice. And yeah, obviously we can talk about exercise, Bobby, probably between the two of us for 3 hours. We, of course, have 5 other pillars, but I did want to mention for everybody, I mentioned your podcast, right? So the first 7 episodes, you have an intro episode, and then episodes 2 through 7 are an entire episode, 30-minute episode roughly devoted to each of the pillars. So of course, in one Choose FI episode, we cannot cover everything. We're just giving you a little smattering, but I would highly recommend, again, subscribe to the podcast, right? Live Long and Well with Dr. Bobby. Download at a minimum those first 7 episodes and go from there. But Bobby, just real quick, because I don't want, I've sidebarred us a couple of times. So the 4 elements, aerobic, and of course, you're not giving specific medical advice to anyone. Let's be clear. You are a doctor, but you're not anyone's doctor on this podcast. But is there like a general advice for, okay, sure, anything is better than nothing and you should start. But how do you think about someone who's relatively fit, like 1 day a week of aerobic, 2, like, is that how you think about it? Or is it kind of more holistic than that?
Well, the studies, and again, I always go back to the studies, haven't really looked at, well, I got 150 minutes a week, but did I do it in 1 day, one long day, or did I do it 7 days and divide it up, 20 minutes or so each day. No, I haven't found the study that would tell us that one makes a difference. So basically, what I generally see people do or try to do is try to get 5 days of, 20 to 30 minutes. And again, it doesn't mean you have to be at the gym. Just go for a walk. Just, take your lunch break, do a conference call while you're walking. Now, you get credit for all that good stuff. So I suggest that. If you can do strength training 20, 30 minutes twice a week, that's brilliant. If you can do simple balance, like when you're brushing your teeth, raise one of your legs and balance on one leg. Look, you got to brush your teeth anyways. It takes a minute or whatever it is. And now you've done some balance. And then, the next time you brush your teeth, stand on the other leg. So you can do that. And then if you can once a week kind of push yourself anaerobically, that's fantastic. I don't expect people can do all of this, but that's kind of a recipe that might point people towards what they might want to think about.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. And anaerobic, so that people might know that maybe more akin to like high intensity interval training, right? HIIT or maximum heart rate,
Exactly.
something like that, like a short but sweet, but pretty intense exercise.
Exactly. It may be a treadmill. You just crank it up pretty fast that you can do for 2 minutes. Could be on the, your Peloton or a bicycle. You're going to push really hard for 2 or 3 minutes. That's really all it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And if anybody's ever been on an air assault bike at a CrossFit gym, maybe 20 seconds all out, but that's
There you
what's
go.
cool, right? You can get up there real quick. Just real quick before we move on, the balance and flexibility. I'm curious, obviously, you mentioned, hey, you could stand on one leg. I mean, that's something that's so actionable and really simple to do. One thing that I've found is interesting between maybe American and Western culture and potentially Asian countries is, or at least I've seen in passing studies on like the incidence of hip fractures and how much people get on and off the ground, on and off the toilet, if you will, in Asian cultures, and the lower incidence of hip fracture as opposed to the United States, where I talk to my parents about this all the time. Like they literally cannot get on the ground and off the ground. And I'm going to be 45 this year. Like I'm spending as much time on the ground, like even just something as simple, Bobby, as like when we're watching TV at night as a family, I'm not sitting on the couch. I'm sitting on the ground in all different postures, legs crossed, things like that, because I'd ideally like to lower my likelihood that you can never lower it to zero, but lower my likelihood of breaking a hip when I'm 60, 70, 80, if I possibly can, with something simple.
And that's exactly how one might approach this. I mean, we sit in nice, comfortable chairs, and that's wonderful and relaxing, but it's doing nothing for our core muscles. If you look at some of these blue zone countries and localities, they don't sit in chairs. I mean, in Okinawa, they do a lot of squatting, so when they're sitting around a campfire or they're even eating or whatever it is, they're not sitting in a chair. They're either squatting or they're sitting on the ground, and sitting on the ground requires your muscles to be engaged. So all those little things make a big difference. You're on a conference call, a Zoom call, stand up and do the call while you're standing. All of these are wonderful ways to do it.
That's really great. And yeah, even just little fidgeting. I mean, people talk about this all the time. I think there's something called NEAT, right? It's like non-exercise activity thermogenesis, if I recollect. And it's just like
Yes.
the little movement during the day. Like, don't just sit there, ramrod straight, not moving. Like, if you have to sit for a while, like you said, it would be wonderful to stand up for a little bit, but even just tap your feet, lift your calves up, do something minor, right?
Yep. Exactly.
All right, let's move on to pillar number two. So, sleep. I think this, for many, many decades, was looked at as like a weakness. Like, oh, I'll sleep when I'm dead, or oh, that successful person gets 4 hours of sleep. So, blah, blah, blah. I can do that too. I think most of that stuff has been proven false, seemingly. And I think a lot of modern science is coming around to just how important sleep is. I'd love to hear you talk at a high level about sleep generally.
Sleep is what I call the unsung hero of health. It's remarkable how important sleep is in terms of how long you live, whether you get Alzheimer's disease, your mood. It's extraordinary. And the sad thing is that Americans, on average, Americans 30, 40 years ago got about 8 hours of sleep. That's fallen to below 7. So below 7 means that half the people may be getting a lot below 7, so 6 hours or even less. From all the studies, it appears there's a bit of a magic number around 7 hours of sleep, and that above 7 hours, you seem to get the benefits. And if you are below that, you have problems. And as I said, the problems are heart attacks, strokes, cognitive decline, things that we really, really, really care about. And another interesting thing is people are like, well, I don't sleep very much during the week, but on the weekends, I try to catch up. Unfortunately, each night is its own beautiful story, and you can't make it up. I've had people ask me an interesting question. It's midnight. Normally, I would get up at 6 so I could do my exercise, get to the gym. What do I do, Dr. Bobby? Should I get up early, not get as much sleep, go to the gym and the benefits of the gym, or should I get that extra hour or two of sleep? My answer is not based on absolute scientific studies, but my reading of the general literature. Sleep longer, you can catch up on your exercise another day, but you can't catch up on your sleep. And when you sleep, and I'm not going to get lost in the neurobiology, if people are interested in sleep, Matthew Walker has both a lovely podcast and a great book called Why We Sleep. If people are interested, that's the best resource. You can listen to my podcast, it'll give you a summary. But when you sleep, things happen. The brain is a very active part of your body, and it creates, in essence, toxins, waste products, and you got to get them out of your brain. And when you sleep, there's a massaging action that gets rid of some of that stuff. And unfortunately, if you don't get that full sleep, you don't get rid of those byproducts, and that can cause problems over the long haul. Not, one all-nighter is not going to do you in, but as a routine, you really, really, really want to try to get around 7 hours or more. 10 hours, not good. 5 hours, not good. 7 to 8, 7 to 8.5 is good. And the wonderful thing about sleep is that and we may not have time to go through all of them, there's 12 things that practically you can either do more of or do less of that will fundamentally help your sleep. And that's the beauty. You've got control over these things. And if you're having challenges with your sleep, very practical, tangible things you can try.
All right, well, let's dive right into that. So 12 things either to avoid or to do to help improve sleep. So yeah, I definitely would love to go through these, Bobby, if we can.
Exactly. And we don't need to get through all 12 of them, but I'll just mention them. So on the things to do, let's promote the positive first, and then we'll take away things you might enjoy that also will help you sleep. So get sunlight early in the day. Get up, get out, and that helps set your biologic clocks, your melatonin secretions. Again, I don't want to get down into the biochemistry, but it's really, really, really helpful. And if you take your dog for a walk, you get a twofer. You get your exercise and you get your sunlight. And if you go with somebody you care about, now you got your social relationships working, and now you've got 3 pillars all at the same time. So that's the first thing. The second is exercise. Exercise helps people sleep. It improves the number of hours of sleep, and it improves the quality of the sleep. So very, very important. And sleep is more than just, I was on the pillow. You've got your REM sleep, you've got your slow wave, deep sleep, and exercise is very, very helpful in that regard. The fourth pillar that we'll get to probably is mind-body activities. So meditation or other type of mind-body harmony activities have been shown in clinical studies of thousands of people to improve people's sleep compared to those that didn't do these kinds of things. Here's one that's critically important for many people, and yours truly is the poster child. Go to bed at the same time each night. Why is that important? Well, yours truly wakes up at 5 in the morning. Whether I go to bed at midnight or I go to bed at 9, if I am forced to be up later, I know I'm getting less sleep. Now, not everybody is this way. Not everybody has that sort of inflexibility. But study after study, lots have been done in adolescence, because we know adolescents tend to stay up crazy hours. Go to bed at the same time each night. Now, you mentioned earlier, and I'll take a quick aside here, the N of 1 concept. So clinical trials, clinical studies, of which I love to talk about, are generally looking at a group of people who did something and a group of people who didn't. It might have been a drug, it might have been surgery, and it's ideally randomly done. And then you ask who did better. And that provides an average. On average, people who take this drug, their blood pressure lowers by 8 points. But that's just an average. For some people, they get a lot more benefit. And some people get a lot less benefit. So an N of 1 study is you become the laboratory test. And the beauty of this and sleep is you can test all the things I'm talking about with you. And within a week or two, you'll know whether it makes a difference for you. So take a baseline assessment. How many hours a night do you typically get over the course of a week? If you happen to have an Apple Watch or a Ring or a Whoop band or any of those things, you can not only tell how many hours, but the stages of sleep. If you don't have one of those, go on the web. There's sleep questionnaires. They basically ask you questions like, how hard was it to go to sleep? Were you waking up in the middle of the night? How rested do you feel the next day? So you can do all this without a fancy watch or anything. Now, once you've got a baseline, try one of these things. Okay, I'm going to bed every night at 10 o'clock. And you come back a week later and say, Dr. Bobby, didn't make any difference. I didn't sleep any longer and I didn't have any better quality. Or you may come back and say, oh my gosh, that made a huge difference. Here's another one. Set your bedroom temperature low, 70 degrees or maybe lower. Now, we do it. Makes a huge difference for Gail and I. You can test it. You're going to be like, well, it uses more energy. I don't really want to do that, and et cetera, et cetera. Try it for a week. Try it for 2 weeks. You can come back and say, Dr. Bobby, made no difference. Fine. That one doesn't work for you. Great. Or here's another one. Take a warm bath or a sauna before bed. That will actually, in spite of what sounds like hot water, it will actually help you sleep. It lowers your body temperature, helps you sleep. Again, you can test it on yourself. All of these things are so testable. Give yourself a chance to unwind with a dark room. Here's one that Gail and I are playing with. This is not based on a major randomized clinical trial. It was a small little study, but it got a lot of press. Wearing socks to bed will improve your sleep. Now, there's biochemical reasons why this might actually work. So Gail and I have been testing this, wearing socks to bed. And I think it actually works. But again, this isn't one of the 6. This is a freebie 7th. Again, all of these, see if it makes a difference for you. And if it does, continue. And if it doesn't, you haven't lost much, but now you know a little bit more about yourself. And this concept of an N of 1 study will come up over and over and over again. If you listen to me, it'll come up with nutrition, and we'll come back to this later. So those are the 6 things, or 6 plus 1, that you can do that might help.
Yeah.
And now if we want to run through the other ones that you should avoid, we can do that.
Cool. Well, no, we will definitely get into that. And I think the most important takeaway that people are going to have from this episode is that N of 1, right? It's understand that you can test this. You don't need fancy equipment. Like Bobby said, you don't need to go out and spend $300 on an Oura Ring. You can just kind of get a sense of, okay, how do I feel in the morning, right? Like you could even just journal this if you wanted to, just very low tech, right?
Perfect.
Which is super cool. And then a lot of these things, like I've noticed, and it was interesting, you talked about the cold room. This has been a massive one for me. And you also mentioned it might be more energy, but interestingly, I would actually argue that it might be net even, because in the winter, we're actually letting it get down to 63 at night. So I'm using dramatically less energy in the winter. And I think 70 is exactly where we set it in the summer, the air conditioning. So we're somewhere between 63 and 70, depending on the time of year.
Perfect.
Which is wonderful.
That's great. So you've done your N of 1 study and it works. Great.
I have indeed.
Good news. So one thing I realized we forgot to mention at the outset, this is an audience that is concerned about retiring and having financial means. I think about approaching retirement as a 3-legged stool. You need to have the money and the resources to have that wonderful time of your life. Secondly, you have to have a reason to wake up in the morning. You have to have a purpose. You have to have activities you care about. But you could have your money and you could have a reason to wake up. But if you don't have the energy or health to do it, it all falls apart. The stool falls apart if you don't have that third leg. And that's why I feel so passionate about helping people. So when they get to that point, they can have the type of retirement and later years that would be very satisfying for them.
Love that. All right, let's go into the things to avoid because I think some of these are going to be eye openers for people.
So caffeine. Yeah, I think everybody knows that caffeine can wake them up. For some people, it doesn't really wake them up. But for me, if I have a real cup of coffee at 7 in the morning, I will have difficulty sleeping at night. It's because I have a genetic kind of variant that means that the caffeine lasts in my system for just about forever. But other people can drink a Coke, drink something late at night, doesn't bother them. How are you going to know if it matters to you? The N of 1 study. If you're not sleeping well, try to cut down on the caffeine or do it very early in the day and see if it works. The next one, people aren't going to like me, alcohol. But Dr. Bobby, when I drink, I fall asleep so beautifully. Yes, you do. And you wake up at 2 in the morning so beautifully and you can't go back to sleep. And even if you did sleep the night, often people feel groggy and not as rested. And I'm not talking about, a hangover. I'm just talking about 1 or 2 glasses of alcohol in the few hours before bed. Makes a huge difference for many people. The studies are very, very clear about this. And it's something, again, to try and see if it makes a difference for you.
Yeah, this one I can personally vouch for. Again, N of 1. Of course, everyone metabolizes differently. Just like Bobby, actually, I'm a fast metabolizer of caffeine. So I took genetic tests and had it analyzed. So I actually have the other side of that. But when we're talking about alcohol, it is shocking to me what an impact even one drink has on my resting heart rate. I think it's about a 10% increase I've found is my resting heart rate goes up 10%. Again, in my N of 1. My wife actually has tested and she has virtually no impact with one, but when she has 2 drinks, her resting heart rate's up about 10% approximately. But most people think, oh, I'm not drunk, I'm not even buzzed or anything. It couldn't have had an impact. I had that drink at 6 p.m. and now I'm going to sleep at 10. I mean, I've seen it as clear as day in my Oura Ring stats. And Bobby, it's shocking.
And it's testable. It may be a bigger issue for some than others. So we talked about the life hack, take your 15-minute walk in the middle of dinner. Here's another one. There's another freebie. Remember back in the 60s and 70s, they would talk about the 3 martini lunch. It was not uncommon for people back then to have alcohol at lunch. I'm bringing back the martini lunch, meaning, and jokingly, if you can have alcohol, have it in the middle of the day. Now, obviously, if it's a work day, not such a great idea, but have your beer or wine at lunch because by the time you go to sleep, could be 8, 10, 12 hours later, the alcohol is very likely to be out of your system. So something you can test and see. Okay, here's one that I think is quite important. People may not realize. Don't eat close to bedtime. Now, your mom probably told you that, way back when. There's something about having a full stomach, could be the metabolism going towards digestion, could be hormones that are circulating. Anyhow, people find that eating close to bedtime doesn't help. And there have been studies that look at this and find that people that eat late before their bedtime, it takes them longer to fall asleep. They wake up in the middle of the night. So that's another one. Here's another one to avoid: napping. Now, napping is wonderful, but napping too late in the days can interfere with your sleep. Ideally, you're going to nap if you do at 1 p.m., 2 p.m. Any later than maybe 3, it may create a problem. And basically, one of the drivers to make you want to sleep is a chemical in the brain called adenosine. And over the course of the day, it builds up. It gets up to such a high level, it's like, I got to hit the pillow. I'm so sleepy. But if you take a nap, that adenosine levels fall. And by the time it's time for bed, you may not have enough of it to tell you to go to sleep. Again, test and see. And it may make a big difference or it may not. Put away screens a couple of hours before bed or at least an hour before bed. Kindle doesn't seem to be a problem. That type of white ink or whatever it is, not a problem for most people, but watching a movie can be a problem. Some people try the blue light glasses. Again, that's something you can test. And that's pretty much it. There's one that I'll mention because my wife invented this and I think it's brilliant. One thing to avoid, don't drink too much liquids close to bed. So
Mm.
if you have to wake up at night to pee, often getting up to do that wakes you up and it gets harder to get back to sleep. So, don't have any fluids after 6 p.m. See if it makes a difference. It may not make a difference. But my wife invented this one. So if you wake up at 2 a.m. and you say to yourself, oh, I got to go to the toilet, and you get up, you go to the toilet, it probably wakes you up, even if you keep your eyes closed. And you may find, or some people find, it's hard to go back to sleep. What she invented, and I find incredibly useful, is when you wake up, you're groggy, tell yourself, nah, I don't really need to go to the toilet. And 90% of the time, 5 minutes later, you're asleep.
Huh.
And of course, you didn't need to get up. So we can talk longer about this, but that's something it's a life hack. Try and see, and it might help you. And it has helped a lot of people.
That's a great one. Yeah, I've heard, I think just to kind of summarize a lot of your things to avoid, like a general rule of thumb, I think maybe popularized by Andrew Huberman or put out in the ether by him at least, the 3-2-1. So it's no eating approximately 3 hours before bed, no liquids approximately 2 hours before bed, and no social media, email, or screens 1 hour before bed. And those are all the three critical things you said to avoid in those windows. I, like you, would extend this personally. Like I try to stop eating and drinking by about 6 p.m. So for me, it's about 4 hours before bed, approximately 3.5, give or take. But yeah, I found that again in my N of one, those little tweaks have helped dramatically.
Wonderful.
All right, let's move on. So I think we've covered two absolutely critical ones. Now we get into one that is maybe in my eyes like the toughest one is nutrition, just because there's so many contradictory headlines and it just nutrition seems confusing to people. I'd love to hear you distill how you think about nutrition as a pillar.
Nutrition is really important. And although it's will sound like I don't believe in anything related to nutrition, what I do believe in is being a good weight for you is unbelievably important for risk factors related to living longer and living well. So, however you get to a reasonable weight, and it's a whole nother discussion to talk about Ozempic and some of the other ones, it's really important to be at a good weight level. Now, how you get there, obviously, you can't eat Twinkies all day long, and that's the only thing you eat. You obviously have to have some sort of a balanced nutrition. And it's best to shop around the periphery of the market, the fresh fruits and vegetables and meats and such. And the aisles have all the processed things. So, to the extent you can do that. So, there are some things I actually support and believe in. Where I don't agree is with all the people who say our way is the right way. Oh, a plant based diet. That's the healthiest. No, 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 no. Paleo. That's what we were meant evolutionarily to eat. No, 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 no. Carbs are bad. They raise your insulin, and insulin is evil. Well, how about the Mediterranean diet? How about, fats are bad. Oh, and saturated fats are especially bad. And you must take probiotics. And intermittent fasting is the key to everything. So there are so many theories and so many approaches in life. I believe if you have this many people saying this many different approaches, it's because none of them really makes much difference over the others. But the headlines sound amazing. Apple cider vinegar will help you lose weight. And the reason why these headlines are so tantalizing is that we as Americans, a third of us are overweight, a third are obese, and a third are probably a good weight. And this is, it used to be 10% of people that had weight issues. Now it's much, much, much higher. And these diets, one versus another, I am not a proponent of. Whatever allows you to eat the right amount of calories, again, not the Twinkie diet, is what I support. And I'm old enough to know that not too many decades ago in the nutrition space, eggs were bad. They have cholesterol in them. Don't eat cholesterol. Shrimp's bad. Lobster's especially bad. And then we learned, oops, we were wrong. They're fine. Coffee used to be bad. Well, it turned out that what they were measuring wasn't the coffee. It was that when they found people that drank coffee, they smoked a cigarette. So it was really the cigarettes, not the coffee. And so much of nutrition research is very small studies, not rigorously done. And it sends people in directions. And then people have their own diet books. So, of course, they're pushing that, or their nutritional supplements. So, they're pushing that. I think the key issue is eat a basic rounded diet and find a way for you to basically eat the right amount of calories. I happen to like intermittent fasting, not because it changes your biochemistry. Some people argue it does. Now, maybe if you didn't eat for 4 days, yes, it'll change your biochemistry. But the 12 or 18 hours that people call intermittent fasting or time restricted eating, I don't think makes a difference there. But what it does help some people is that it reduces the number of meals, so it reduces the chances of eating a lot. There's no magic. So if that helps you, that's wonderful. If the get up in the middle of your meal and go for a walk helps you, that's wonderful too. So I wish there was a magic bullet, a magic approach. And we have learned a lot about what diet and appetite is from the new weight loss drugs, which has really opened people's eyes to the problem and the solutions. But if you're not going to be on those drugs, you got to find an alternative way. And basically, you do your N of one, try to figure out what works for you.
Yeah, that last thing you said is really intriguing. Obviously, I would love to have you back on as many times as you're willing to come back on the show. So maybe we can talk about what we have learned from these new weight loss drugs and how that
It's
impacts.
very powerful. And Weight Watchers has completely changed its approach. It used to be a shaming approach. They get you on the scale. I don't know much about it, Weight Watchers, so I don't want to malign them. But there was a period of time where they would get you on the scale in front of people. And if you didn't lose weight, then they would say, oh, you don't have enough willpower or whatever it is, go and try harder. And what we've learned is even people who never were able to lose weight or kept losing weight and it comes back on, they do brilliantly on these drugs. There is something going on in the brain, there's something going on in your stomach that we cannot ignore any longer. Maybe someday we will have drugs that are inexpensive that you could take for the rest of your life and really solve the problem. But until that's the case, then we're back to the standard stuff that I've alluded to.
Yeah, and what I've heard is there's early indications, and I think it's too early to say this definitively by any means, but that these weight loss drugs are actually showing like a decrease in a lot of addictive type behaviors. So I've heard in passing that people are seeing like a lower incidence of smoking for people who are taking them, a lower gambling. Again, too early to say. I'm not saying this as definitive. I haven't read any studies, but I've heard that numerous times from numerous different places, and it's intriguing to see what the impacts are going to be of these Ozempic and such.
Profound, very profound.
Yeah,
And look, I don't take money from these
of
companies
course, of course.
and all, but I'm just an observer of the literature. The sad truth, though, is when you stop the drugs, the weight comes back on for almost everybody. Even though they're like, no, I've got it solved. This won't happen to me. Invariably, it does, and almost everybody. So that's a sad piece of the puzzle,
Yeah.
but they're very effective.
Yeah, two things I wanted to get your thoughts on that you said in passing in the explanation of nutrition. So, well, first, I love that you're like there's no religious war here. I think you're you're very careful to say like, listen, a lot of these people do get into their little camps of, oh, carnivore is the best. It's my religion in essence. I'm going to fight to the death for it. Like that doesn't seem to make any sense to me, and I love your thoughts on that. But so you said a basic rounded diet. I want to get your thoughts on that, but also how it ties into, you said something to the effect of like the right number of calories. And I think a lot of people, myself very much included, until this past roughly 18 months where I started tracking my calories. And now I always thought that was frankly like kind of odd behavior, people who track their calories, because I was worried that anytime you get into like deprivation type mindset, especially like akin to a short termism, I think that's something, Bobby, that we go the opposite here at Choosify is we think long term. So whenever I think of, hey, I'm going on a budget for a short period of time, I'm going on a diet for a short period of time, like almost akin to that shaming of like you talked about in Weight Watchers, like I feel like any short termism is doomed to fail. So that in my mind, I conflated that with tracking calories. But my mind has been open to I had no idea how much I was eating. I had no idea that one of my favorite foods, peanut butter, which sadly I have like the regular Skippy or whatever Jif. I was eating probably 800 calories a day of peanut butter, just like 3 spoonsful, 3 heaping spoons, granted. But like, I mean, I cut that out and it was a dramatic difference, just literally cutting peanut butter. And like, again, I think of myself as a healthy person. I had no idea what I was eating until I actually started tracking it.
It's a critical issue. And, if we look back over the decades, portions in restaurants have literally doubled. And we begin to approach our meals with that mindset that this is what a full plate is. And not even talking about, yes, this is how much of your plate should be your broccoli versus your starch versus your meat, but just the size of the plate has grown and the amount of food that you put on the plate. So it's huge. So counting your calories is great to give you a sense of, I had no idea that the sandwich I made, which I thought was healthy, by the time you added everything up, it was, 1,000, 1,200 calories. Or that Cheesecake Factory cheesecake, which I love, it could have 12 or 1,500 calories. It's like I had no idea. So you asked earlier about people should be at a good weight for them. So for many, many people, they can remember back to their college days or their 20s, and they were like, yeah, if I could be that weight, I would be very, very happy. Well, then Now, obviously, if you were a young man, you might have had more muscles back then than you do now, but you have a rough idea of what your weight could be, should be. And then you obviously hear in the movies or whatever, I can still get into my wedding tuxedo. I mean, you have a sense of that. Now, for people who have been overweight all their life, okay, that's going to be a little more difficult because they maybe don't have that mental image and what the weight associated with that. But for the vast majority of people, I think they do. Now, if you're a devotee and you really want to figure out how many calories my body burns, it's not very expensive to go to one of these places and get a basal metabolic rate. You basically lie down, you breathe into this mask, it measures CO2 and other things. And then 20 minutes later, it will give you a printout, which will say, if you do nothing during the day, this is how many calories you'll burn. If you're walking around just like a normal person, you'll add another couple hundred calories. And then your exercise program goes on top of that. Is it a perfect test? No. Will it vary from week to week, month to month? Sure, it could. But it'll give you an inkling about whether my basal rate is 1,200 calories a day or 2,000 calories a day. And then that plus counting your calories for a short period of time will give you a sense.
Nice. I like that. That's a great way to start. And I guess, what would you say is most glaringly missing or not sufficient in most people's diets? Are there like simple things that people could add that you find generally people are not getting enough of?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that question because I forgot to mention it. The Twinkie diet is not a good thing for a whole host of reasons, but in part because it's missing a critical element of what you need, and that's protein. So, protein, generally speaking, people don't get enough of it. And we all love carbs, we love other things. Obviously, if you're on a keto diet or something, you're probably having a fair bit of protein. But the recommended daily amount of protein is about 50 grams per person per day. That's way too low. Probably needs to be 80 or 100. The numbers that people quote is 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which is sort of zero point 0.6 to zero point 0.8 grams per pound of body weight. I weigh 150 pounds, so I would like to get about 100 grams a day. Now, I'm a carb lover. Left to my own devices, I'll have oatmeal for breakfast with some butter on it, maybe some fruit. Dinner, I'll have pasta. And lunch, I might have a little bit of something that contains protein. I could easily finish the day at 30 grams and not blink. And that's why counting these types of things gives you a sense of it. The good news is that it's not that hard to get the right amount of protein. I love cottage cheese. You can easily get 20 or 30 grams of protein in your cottage cheese. Have 3 or 4 eggs, if you like eggs or egg whites. Now you're at 20 or 25 grams of protein. Obviously, if you have some chicken or some fish or whatever for a meal, that'll get you 20 or 30. The key is that you need to think about it for each and every meal, or you'll be like Bobby and you'll end up with 20 at the end of the day. Why do we need our protein? Well, it goes back to our strength and our muscle loss that we talked about earlier. Not having enough protein, those are going to get worse.
Yeah, it's so important. And yeah, that's the one aspect of my diet that has changed the most in the last year and change, where I'm actually targeting somewhere in the vicinity of like 180 grams of protein a day. And I have to say, it's not that hard to hit when you make a concerted effort. But to your point, prior to this, like you could go through your life and eating full meals, or so you think, and get 30 to 50 grams of protein a day, which is just wholly insufficient. Whereas, like,
Exactly.
now I'm eating, like, for me, Bobby, the best bang for my buck are the Oikos 000 Greek yogurts. They're like
Uh-huh.
90 calories for 15 grams of protein, and they're delicious. So I'm probably eating 3 or 4 of those a day, and it's just easy. And that's a free
Beautiful.
60 grams of protein, it feels like.
Beautiful.
All right, let's go to pillar number 4. This is one that I think a lot of people's eyes have been open to over the last maybe decade or two is mind body work. I'd love to hear you talk through this.
Yeah, mind body work's been around for a long time. And if you go back to the 60s and 70s and the hippie era, they were all going to these institutes and meditating and doing these other kinds of things. And that's great. And people feel better and their stress level goes down, depression goes down. That's all wonderful. But what we've also learned is that these same activities, I talked earlier about how meditation helped our sleep, they also help us to live longer and live well. The body and the mind are truly connected. Obviously, the mind tells the body to do stuff, move your legs, go for a walk, take a breath. The mind is obviously telling the body things. And the body, conversely, tells the mind things. I talked earlier about your stomach can tell your brain, up, I'm full. Or your muscles can say to your brain, we need more oxygen, tell the lungs to start doing more work. So there's absolutely a connection between them, and it's a very important piece of the puzzle. What we've also learned is that stress and how you measure it and define it is always, an interesting question. But baseline stress levels relate directly to the likelihood of having a heart attack or dying due to a heart-related disease. And they did this study in Britain with 7,000 people, and they followed them for 18 years and basically said, what was their stress levels and did they die of heart-related diseases? And the answer was yes. And then this was duplicated in 52 countries around the world, similar kinds of things. So I don't want to get too far into this. People can ask me separately if they want to. You can listen to the podcast on this. But what we have learned is that meditation or something as simple as breath work or qigong or yoga really makes a difference. And studies have shown it reduces depression, helps sleep, reduces your blood pressure. In a study of meditation, they found that people who meditated regularly, their blood pressure dropped almost as much as taking a drug.
Wow.
Now, you may need to take a drug and meditate, but it's very powerful. And if you're not a woo woo person, I'm not in this new age stuff. I can't sit for 30 minutes and meditate. Do something as simple as breath work. Andrew Huberman has a wonderful podcast episode on breath work. And something as simple as taking deep breath, and I'll just sort of demonstrate. It's called a sort of accelerated sigh. You take a breath before letting out, take a second breath, then let it out. Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. So it sort of sounds like this. Now, don't hyperventilate. Take your time. Do it for 3 to 5 minutes. It will make a difference. People are like, no, that's just new age stuff. When you think about people who are shooting a rifle, snipers, what do? They take a breath and they let it out. This is physiologic. It has nothing to do with whether you believe in Buddha or not. And that's something very, very simple. So you can incorporate this into your daily life. So when you're going out for your walk in the morning, getting your sunlight with your spouse, getting all these pillars done, do some breathing. And now you've got almost everything completed in your first 20 minutes of your day.
Yeah, that is that is really spot on, Bobby. I love that. And you talked about that one particular breathing exercise, and you mentioned you followed that with if you're shooting a rifle, right? What's interesting is the Navy SEALs do something called box breathing. So
Yes.
this is something you can Google, but essentially it's just, let's say, 4 seconds in through the nose, hold for about 4 seconds, 4 seconds out through the nose, hold at the bottom on empty for about 4 seconds, and just think of it as a box, 4 seconds on each side. And you will be shocked. You just do 5 or 10 rounds of that. It's amazing what a difference it can make. And I found, yeah, that type of breathing helps a lot. You mentioned meditation. I know people are always looking for actionable things. I'll link these two in the show notes. And if you have any that you want to recommend, I can certainly put them in. But there's a yoga nidra. So this is not yoga like we think of yoga, movement practice, but it's basically a guided meditation. Andrew Huberman now calls this, he's coined this as non-sleep deep rest. So when I'm really tired and I don't want to take a nap or whatnot, I put on this 10-minute yoga nidra. I've been doing this for about 6 years now. And Bobby, it is so relaxing. It's incredible. And that 10 minutes just kind of rejuvenates me. And I also got recently introduced to a meditation app called Insight Timer. So it's Insight Timer. And there's one particular, this is a bit longer one. It's 23 minutes, but it's called Deep Healing. And I just absolutely love this particular one. I did it for I think 60 days straight. And it was just like a nice, wonderful part of my day. So I'll link both of those up in the show notes for sure. But yeah, I mean, this is something that's become a big part of my life, certainly more recently.
And if you don't believe it's helpful, do the N of one study. Try it for a week. Have a baseline assessment of anxiety. There are questionnaires you can fill out, or just, on a scale of 1 to 10, how anxious am I typically? 6, 8. Do this for a week. Come back, test it, ask yourself that. And if it doesn't work, fine, it doesn't work. But for many people, it's very helpful. And you've just mentioned how helpful it's been for you.
Yeah. And it does not hurt to test, right? I mean, I can't think of anybody who's going to be worse off for having spent 10 minutes lying down or sitting quiet and just focusing on their breath, right? To me, it's at worst neutral and almost certainly a universal good. But like you said, N of one, you have to test.
You have to test. Then you'll know.
You will know. So, okay. I absolutely love this. Let's move on to number 5, which is exposure to both hot and cold.
Yes. And look, saunas and rolling in the snow have been around for thousands of years. Sauna was sort of originated in Finland. That was a very popular thing just 2,000 years ago. And rolling in the snow, people have been doing that forever, back in the time of Hippocrates, thousands of years ago. Cold exposure was something they did to bring fevers down, obviously. And if you got injured, that they would do that. So it's been around a long time, but just because it stands the test of time doesn't mean there's actually any evidence that it works. So, of course, since my middle name is Evidence, I wanted to sort of dive in and really understand the evidence. And the good news is that saunas, exposure to heat and exposure to cold really, really in measurable ways can help you live longer and definitely feel better. So here's some data. So saunas have been shown, people that do sauna have been shown to have a lower likelihood of a heart attack, lower likelihood of a stroke, lower likelihood of cognitive decline, sort of the triple threat that we would like to find. Now, in a lot of studies, you would ideally like to, as I mentioned earlier, you randomize people. These people did something, these people didn't, and you now learn what happens. But for a lot of things in life, you can't randomize people for 30 years. So you kind of have to do what's called an observational study, where you sort of follow people and see what happens. And for saunas, they've shown that it's very powerful. One thing that makes these observational studies more likely to be true is when you have what's called a dose-response relationship, which sounds like a big fancy term. But what it really means is if you look at people who did 1 sauna a week versus 3 saunas a week versus 5 saunas, the more you did, the better you did. That begins to help you think, there may be something to this. And people who did less than 10 minutes didn't do as well as people who did 10 to 20 minutes or 20 and above. So this also helps you to believe it. And we talked earlier about heat having a beneficial help before you go to sleep. So those are some of the benefits. The a little bit challenging part of saunas and things like sauna, like a steam bath, is that not everybody has access to one. The beauty of some of the studies is they come out of Finland. And in Finland, Basically, there's one sauna for every two people. Whether you're rich or poor,
Huh.
unemployed or employed, you have access to a sauna. And so it separates what people say. Well, the people who do saunas, they have more free time, they're richer, and it has nothing to do with the sauna. It has to do with the fact that they have more free time. But in Finland, that sort of eliminates that problem. And so we actually do believe the results. But you can try to find a gym that has it. YMCAs may have a sauna. So not quite as easy as the next one, which is exposure to cold. Now, problem with this one is I got a lot of people say to me, well, Dr. Bobby, I can do the sauna thing. That I can do. But I'm not getting in any cold water. I don't like cold water. And most people don't like cold water. The beauty of exposure to cold, not only does it work, and it helps not only in terms of helping injuries heal, but if you measure the happy hormones in your body, they go up threefold, sixfold when you get into cold exposure, typically in a cold plunge experience. And it's only 3 to 5 minutes, but measurable differences in how people feel. You know, lovely studies done in, again, Finland. Some people swim in the winter. And in Finland, swimming in the winter is pretty darn cold. So they took people in October and said, how happy are you? You know, how stressed do you feel? Then half of the group didn't swim. The other half did this winter swimming. They measured them in February or January. And the people who did the winter swimming were way better mood, way happier, way less evidence of depressed feelings. So there's evidence that it works. Well, how can you try this without sort of doing something that's so difficult? Turn the water to cold at the very end for 30 seconds. Let me tell you, it's a lot easier to do it in the summer than the winter. So start doing it now. And then when the winter comes around, you'll gradually be able to do it. Or go to the market, buy a couple of bags of ice, throw it in your bathtub and climb in. Again, a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And if you're a real devotee, try to find a cold plunge tank. It's really easy to try this out. And again, do your N of 1 study. And if you don't feel happy, not just for the 5 minutes after you stopped hitting your head against the wall with the cold, but for hours, let me know. Most people feel fundamentally happy, alive, awake, alert for hours. Give it a try.
Yeah. And like you said, it is hard, right? I mean, people are going to come to you and complain about it because it's not easy to get into cold water. But man, if you feel that much better afterwards and it's lasting, that seems well worth a couple minutes of
Give it
potential.
a try.
Right.
Just give it a try. Yeah.
And I think something we talked about before reminded me of the phrase, I think it's hormesis, right? So it's like introducing a little bit of a stressor, but that's actually going to be like a net positive for you. So I think about like walking outside, right? As opposed to going to a gym and walking on a treadmill, which certainly is better than sitting on a couch. Let's be clear, not even close. Treadmill is wonderful as compared to a couch, but if you can get outside and walk when it's raining, walk when it's 20 degrees, walk when it's 100 degrees. We sit in these hermetically sealed boxes at 70 to 75 degrees, 365 days a year. And, our bodies probably could use the 100 every now and again and the 20 every now and again. And I think that might fit into that concept of hormesis, right, Bobby?
It does. And if folks are sort of intrigued by this, Michael Easter wrote a book that came out probably a year ago, a New York Times bestseller called The Comfort Crisis. And Brad, you and I can talk about this on another podcast, but there's a lot to be said for challenging yourself and how our lives have become so comfortable with air conditioning and chairs and whatever that we've lost something, both psychologically and health wise. So, yeah, it's a good book if you're interested in the topic.
Wholeheartedly agreed. We will definitely come back to that because one of the concepts in that book he talked about was misogi. So this is basically doing an adventure that is just extraordinarily difficult. And both the lead up to it, he said, so misogi would be, okay, I think there's a 50% likelihood that I'm going to succeed at this. And how many things do we do in life that are actually, as adults, that are actually really difficult? And that we, even as prepared as we might be, it might just not happen. Though one of his caveats was you cannot die on this, which is kind of hilarious. But that misogi concept is something that I'm actively working on. So I'm glad you brought that book up. We'll definitely come back to that at some point in the future.
Wonderful.
All right, Bobby, before we move on to number 6, I just wanted to ask real quickly about the heat, because I think this might be something that is more practical for most people. So like you said, it might be a little difficult to get to a gym or YMCA. The YMCA is a really good option for a traditional sauna. Some people might have hot tubs at home. Obviously, we have showers that we can kick up pretty hot. There are these new infrared saunas. Just in real quick hit, like would those 3 compare to that traditional kind of Finnish sauna?
Well, I'm a show me the evidence kind of guy. And the problem is there are no data to tell us whether a hot shower is enough. I live in Texas. It's pretty darn hot during the summer. Is walking around outdoors in the heat and the humidity enough to do that? We don't know. I have an infrared sauna, so it's a little bit of a leap of faith between the conventional and the infrared, but I think the data is enough on the conventional that I believe it. But on the things that aren't truly the sauna of the 140 degrees, 160 degrees, we don't know. It certainly isn't going to hurt, but whether it gets you these life-changing benefits, we don't know. And until I've seen the data, I can't really say to folks, yes, this is good enough. I wish I could tell you, but the evidence isn't there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for being so forthright with that. So yeah, we'll touch base on that maybe a couple of years from now when maybe the evidence is in or
Exactly.
either way, right? So okay, we have the last pillar, which is really important, and it's something that we talk about here at Choose a Vi a lot, which is maybe one of the reasons to pursue financial independence is that we can have the time and space to spend our most precious resource, which is our time, doing what we want with who we want, right? Our family, our friends, our community, and social relationships. I think this is something, sadly, a lot of people neglect, certainly in modern day America. And it's so important. But I fear that this is the one that's missed the most by people.
It is missed by most people. And I think if you sort of phrase it in a different way, people will be like, oh, yeah, you're right. This is something I've always known. So there's data on what happens when one spouse dies to the other spouse.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the risk of the second spouse dying in the next week or the next month or the next 6 months is doubled.
Wow.
Now you could say, oh, well, that's because, one spouse smokes, so the other spouse smokes, so it's no surprise. I don't think that's the case. I think the stress and the change in that connectivity, losing that is what I believe is going on. So the data is pretty clear if you look at that losing a spouse, there's a much higher likelihood the other spouse won't survive.
Hmm.
An interesting discussion we can have another day is whether men are better at this than women. It appears that when men lose their wife, they don't do nearly as well as when women lose their husband. And that may be because women historically and today typically do better at relationships than the average man. They have more of a circle of folks. One of the most important studies that has gotten popularized is the Harvard study of adult development. And this was a study that started 75 years ago at Harvard, where they basically took a bunch of Harvard men, because at the time Harvard didn't take women, and compared them to folks that lived in Boston, young men that lived in Boston that didn't have the same social and educational benefits. And they tracked them forward over decade after decade after decade. The scientists who were running the study would die, and another scientist would pick up and carry the baton. And not long ago, they came out with some fascinating results that they asked the question, I wonder what factors in somebody's 50s, when they're in their 50s, will predict whether they'll live into their 70s and beyond and how functional they'll be. And you would think, well, did they exercise in their 50s? Did they smoke? Did they, have their blood pressure under control? Those are all, of course, important. But the number one predictive factor was whether these people had satisfying social relationships. Those that did lived longer and were more functional as they got older than those that didn't. Now you can then drill in, well, what does it mean to have a satisfying social relationship? And there's some wonderful articles and books that we could link to if folks are interested. But there's multiple factors. I mean, the obvious one is, do you have somebody you can call at 2 in the morning if you were ill or you had something difficult going on in your life? That's one aspect of having a social relationship. But there's other pieces of the puzzle. Do you have somebody in your life you can have fun with? Is there somebody in your life that you spend time with where you learn from them, learn with them? These are all different things. Of course, there's, romantic intimacy is what people often think of. And what some of the teachings are is that you don't need to get all of that from one person. I've been blessed to be married for over 40 years, but if you go through the checklist of different aspects of relationship, you don't have to get it from one person. So I have fun with my wife, but I have fun differently with my male friends. I learn with my wife, but I learn different things with other people. So again, we all enjoy having others in our life, or many people do, but it affects our health and well-being in ways that go beyond just, anxiety and depression. And people are like, yeah, this all sounds a little woo-woo. How can this possibly be true? Well, imagine carrying a burden with you emotionally. Oh, I'm not getting along with this person in my life. I've lost my job. That is a very stressful experience. And if you look at the biochemistry, your cortisol goes up, your blood pressure may go up. Having somebody to share that with has been shown to reduce your stress level. So, stress leads to bad things. Relationships help reduce stress. It's not rocket science to say how it's possible that one is connected. And the data, again, is pretty strong that relationships lead to positive things with health and well being.
Yeah, I love how you brought the evidence into that and also mentioned that the Harvard study of adult development. I know pretty much any book you read on happiness is always quoting that particular longitudinal study. Like, I mean, that's probably chapters of most books on happiness. So they have been studying this for quite literally what 7 or 8 decades now, somewhere in that vicinity. And it's
Absolutely.
remarkable. It's remarkable what a difference social relationships make. So I would love to see you do an episode, a future episode on your podcast on precisely that quote, the quote, satisfying social relationships.
And in fact, it's the one I'm recording tomorrow that
You're kidding
should
me.
be out in the next week.
Okay, that
So
is
that's pillar
incredible.
number 6.
We did not tee that up, obviously. That was perfectly natural. So that will be out well before this podcast episode comes out. So that will exist. You can binge that to all the listeners. And like I mentioned, Bobby's podcast is phenomenal. I have spent, I mean, really the last decade of my life taking in and trying to synthesize in my kind of layman's version all this health and wellness information. And I have not found a place and a person who has synthesized this and summarized it better than Bobby. So, Live Long and Well with Dr. Bobby is the podcast. It's absolutely fantastic. And Bobby, I know you have actually a ranch, so a Madrone Springs Ranch outside of Austin, Texas, where, as I understand it, you're kind of living and breathing these pillars with visitors to your ranch. And I'd love for you to talk about that just for a minute or two while we close out here.
Yes, we lived in LA forever. We moved to the Austin area about 10 years ago and got the crazy idea to buy some land. And we ended up finding this amazing raw land that we've basically put together exotic animals and a bed and breakfast. It's not your typical bed and breakfast in that it only has one group or one family at a time. So you have the privacy of 178 acres. But what's evolved over the last year or so is that these 6 pillars now are front and center in people's experiences. We have a yoga studio and a fitness center, and you can get a massage, and I'll cook meals that are hopefully healthy and yummy for you. We've got a cold plunge and a sauna. And so all of these things, and there's 6 miles of trails to hike on, and there's places to swim in the creek. So we're hoping that folks will not only have a wonderful time and have lovely accommodations, but they'll learn the 6 pillars, they'll get to practice them, and they'll go home and hopefully it will change their lives. And that's really what it's all about, is to have a chance to help educate people and help them along this journey that I feel so passionate about.
That's incredible. I would love to visit there in the future, and maybe, just maybe, we could put together. We're doing a lot more of these live FI gatherings and Phi events. So I could see that being a potential future locale for a Phi event. So stay tuned on that. And Bobby, I just wanted to thank you for being just so generous with your time and your knowledge. I know we're at over an hour and a half now, and this has just been absolutely fantastic. I feel like we just barely scratched the surface. We could probably talk about this for another 50 hours. So I would love to have you back on in the future, and maybe we can dive into really specific topics over the months and years.
Wonderful. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to the feedback from your listeners.
Nice. All right. Thank you again. And thanks for listening, everybody. I really appreciate you being here.